Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
Hello and welcome to the panel discussion of World Today. I'm Ding Heng in Beijing. International peacekeeping missions are in peril due to global geopolitical deadlock, funding issues, and declining personnel numbers, according to a recent report by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. The analysis has found just under 79,000 personnel were deployed in international peacekeeping missions at the end of 2025, its lowest level in 25 years, and 40% lower than in 2016. The study says missions managed by the United Nations have been affected most seriously. What could be the consequences of a significant weakening of multilateral conflict management? Can this trend be reversed? These questions and much more in this edition of the program. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. So joining us now on the line are Dr. Wen Jing, Research Fellow at the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University, Professor Kevin Nauen, Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences and International Relations at Pannasastra University of Cambodia, and a Senior Research Fellow at the Asian Vision Institute. Joseph Siracusa, Professor of Global Futures with Curtin University in Australia. So thank you very much for joining us, Joseph, Kevin, and Dr. Wen Jing. Joseph, to start with you, according to this report by the Swedish think tank, the number of international peacekeeping personnel has been in decline over the past decade or so, and during this period, 2025 actually saw the sharpest year-on-year drop of some 17%. What do you make of this trend? Is it a legitimate concern that this trend is actually accelerating?
Yes, I'm concerned. I mean, I'm not shocked. I'm a little surprised though that the figures have gone the way they are. Look, the United Nations has always had a liquidity problem. A number of the great powers, and I mean here the United States and a few others, don't really want to contribute these days. They don't like what the peacekeepers do, and they don't like a lot of the other agencies at the United Nations. The United States, has never been a great friend of the United Nations. Even when it was founded in San Francisco many, many years ago, the United States has always been very suspicious of an organization that has authority over the United States, perhaps, and from time to time. They don't like that kind of thing. And so the United States tries not to contribute more than 22% of the overall. Sometimes they've done more and sometimes, I guess, less. But the United States is $4 billion in arrears. Now, look, the United Nations is a big organization. It's got thousands of people. They pay for everything, room, board, medical, the whole business. And you need money for an organization like that to run. And what is more important than peacekeepers? I can't imagine what it is, okay? But it does reflect sort of an abandonment of what the United Nations does. And it's somebody has already called it the perfect storm of all these problems that are being created around the world or exacerbating the United States and other nations withdrawing from their responsibilities. And things could only get worse. Now, when the United States withdraws with aid and medicine and things like that, it accelerates these problems. What could be more desperate than people looking for food or medicine or a place to lay their head at night? I mean, we got millions of refugees on the go. And as I say, I've always thought the United Nations has done great work. And I know Australia, which is a middle power, has always appreciated the work of the United Nations. In fact, Australia identifies with the United Nations as one of its pillars of the kinds of things that want to be identified with. But look, this is not a good sign. And I say it represents Donald Trump moving from these kinds of organizations. Now, it's just not Trump. I mean, people before Trump wanted to move away from supporting the United Nations. But my goodness, they, as I say, they do important work. And they don't really like what the peacekeepers do, particularly in Lebanon and places like that. That interferes with America's Israeli allies and all this kind of thing. So it's a very complicated thing. But I'll tell you what, at the end of the day, The
Mhm.
United Nations peacekeeping is a perfectly legitimate and important function of something like the United Nations. In fact, if it didn't have these facilities or capabilities, we'd have to create them next week. I mean, because they do important work.
Mm. Dr. Wen Jing, going to you. In terms of the funding issue, the 2025 to 2026 UN peacekeeping budget approved by the UN General Assembly is 5.38 billion US dollars, but it is actually suffering from a 2 billion US dollar shortfall due to the failure of some large donor countries to meet their financial commitments. How much does funding matter to UN peacekeeping missions, in your opinion?
Okay, thanks for having me. For my understanding, I think absolutely funds is so important, so essential for, for international organizations. And I can say the lifeline, for United Nations peacekeeping missions. I see without adequate funds, I think peacekeeping operations cannot function properly. Actually, right now, the UN peacekeeping missions mostly depend on the fundings from these major countries like China, US, yeah, other countries. So without adequate funds, peacekeeping operations cannot function, right? Let alone protect civilians and also stabilize the situations. For my standing, the funds pays for troops, right? The troops support the military over there, and also like the flights, the gears, and also the patches. This all provided by the funds. And also, you just mentioned that there are $2 billion shortage right now. So, the missions, they have to cut staff, scale down, scale back patches, etc. So I think this can just have a very bad influence. This can't protect the people. So this also makes conflicts more dangerous and unstable in the
Mm.
current station.
Mm. So, Kevin, talking about funding, according to analysis by the Australia-based think tank, the Lowy Institute, across five active UN peacekeeping missions in Africa, a mandated 15% expenditure reduction is translating into a 25% cut in terms of uniform and civilian peacekeeping personnel. How would you explain the logic behind this? And what do you think this tells us about the importance of funding for international peacekeeping operations?
Yeah, thank you for the question. If we look at a budget cut of 15%, and Lowy is estimating this is resulting in a 25% personnel reduction, this just kind of reflects the reality of how the costs go into peacekeeping operations. Personnel costs are the largest single budget line for missions, and when funds are cut, personnel reductions are the fastest and really the most direct way to achieve savings, even if they are kind of operationally the most damaging. The multiplier effect in relation to the funding also reflects the fixed costs, though, right? So there will be, impacts on logistics, transportation, communications, base infrastructure overall. All of that must be maintained regardless of troop numbers. So, the fixed costs are less flexible. And so it's going to be the personnel costs that take the bigger hit where the focus is going to be. They kind of absorb in that regard, a disproportionate share of the overall cut. And what this tells us is that the relationship between funding and operational capacity in peacekeeping is, not a linear correlation. Reductions in funding are going to produce a kind of outsized impact on personnel cuts.
Mm. So, when it comes to funding challenges for UN peacekeeping missions, of course, like Professor Joseph Siracusa indicated earlier, the elephant in the room is the United States under President Donald Trump. Washington has, of course, cut many of its international aid programs and is also looking to dial back its commitments to international organizations, international institutions. When the White House Budget Office proposes eliminating all U.S. funding for UN peacekeeping missions in 2026, it cites mission failures in Mali, Lebanon, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example. So, Kevin, in your opinion, is that a legitimate ground for Washington to scale back its funding?
In my opinion, it is not. Again, I'm a supporter of the UN and UN peacekeeping, on the basis that, again, there is no viable alternative at this time. So you have to kind of go with the best you got, despite its imperfections. Now, Joseph did point out there are tensions, long-term tensions between the United States and the UN, but consistently over time as well, the United States has been a major donor, and despite its reluctance, a key to support of the UN overall. But again, we are seeing a big change. So this, I think, is something quite new with the Trump administration. Elephant in the room is an apt description, considering his party is, staunchly behind him as well. So, this argument that these failures are the reason why Washington should pull out, again, it doesn't make sense for a couple reasons. One, empirically, there's always been problems, substantial problems with UN peacekeeping. By some accounts, it's hard to find a mission that was, truly a success, an unqualified success in accordance with its mandate. Some obviously more successful than others. But again, I'm in Cambodia, look at the Cambodian case. UNTAC is considered a major success, but again, now it's one of the SEA cases, right, where sexual exploitation and abuse occurred, right, in large scale. So there are major problems with the case as well. So certainly not an unqualified success. What the Trump administration, though, is doing is basically using this as a reasoning for pulling out, when actually, its own actions have contributed to the failures of these operations. And so it's a somewhat of a circular reasoning, but a circular reasoning that is self-serving. And so they're trying to basically lay the blame on the operations instead of laying the blame on the involved states, right? That doesn't mean they're all equally responsible. And this is a common problem with scapegoating the UN, is that the UN is treated as the actor, the agent in the process of the international relations and the outcomes in the case, rather than the states themselves, right? And again, there are some ways in IR theory we can look at United Nations as an agent, but for the most part, it is a forum. It is a forum for states. So, you have to look at the cause of a specific effect or outcome as the behavior and actions, decisions, choices, and interactions of the states.
So, by the way, what do you mean when you said that some of the actions of the current U.S. government has contributed to the failure of certain UN peacekeeping missions across the world?
Well, the general antagonism toward the UN and how that works in terms of the withholding of funding, but also the unwillingness to compromise and find a way through Security Council deadlocks.
Okay. So, Professor Siracusa, going back to you, the study by the Stockholm-based think tank has also pointed to hardline demands and veto threats from some permanent members of the UN Security Council, saying they have complicated decisions on renewing peacekeeping operations mandates. We know last year, the UN Security Council voted to terminate the UN peacekeeping forces in southern Lebanon at the end of this year, after nearly 5 decades of operations. Do you think it is fair to say that the vote last year was a result of pressure from Washington and, for that matter, Tel Aviv?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, without Washington pushing this thing, it couldn't go anywhere. And I want to connect this thread with what Kevin just said, and that is that there's something else going on beneath the surface here that I'd like to raise, and that is in the 1990s, Kofi Annan, the Secretary of the United Nations, raised the prospect of the concept of human security. That is, that the international community had an obligation to come to the assistance of people who are, not doing very well under their own states. That is, and this had a catch phrase to it. It was called R2P, Responsibility to Protect. Gareth Evans and others from the International Crisis Group wrote up this doctrine. The world kind of accepted it. Everybody kind of pitched in and talked about the international community's obligation to help those who have been abandoned by their own states. I think a lot of that because of politics of the last 20 years. And I'm talking here about populist governments in Europe and other places. I'm talking about international feelings, this kind of thing. I think this doctrine has been abandoned. Now, this is the end of it. I thought R2P was a pretty good idea because it suggested that we all have an obligation to do something if we can, whether it's Ethiopia, Sudan, or whatever it was. There are people dying every day in these places, and Darfur and others. And we look away, and with these populist governments in place in different places, particularly those representing the Security Council. It's as though these people don't matter. There's kind of a two-tiers thing here. I mean, what they seem to do is more important than people dying someplace else. So, we have that kind of dismissive tone, which is not very pleasant, as a matter of fact. But I think the doctrine of human security, which made sure that we all had sort of an iron in the fire, has now sort of disappeared or been discredited by people like Trump and populist governments around the world. And so it's now been replaced by kind of a free-for-all. But, these multiple country disputes, that is, the role of the multipolarity of states is more important than ever. I mean, what could be more important than the United Nations acting at least as an interlocutor or a guard or a referee, and it's not like they determine where they're going. They super senior managers of peacekeeping make it very clear that they are moving on the mandates that have been handed to them by the General Assembly and by the Security Council. I mean, they're not making this stuff up where they go, and it's dangerous where they go. These people get shot, and sometimes the peacekeepers behave very badly, but a lot of times they go to places where there is no peace to keep, as a matter of fact, and they're putting their lives in their hands. I remember I wrote a book called Human Security and Globalization when I went to the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology as a professor, and on the cover of the book I had the blue helmets worn by Chinese peacekeepers. I thought that was very telling that the whole world was involved in this kind of thing, and I wanted to make the point that everybody, East and West, were deeply involved in human security, but not so much more anymore.
Dr. Wen Jing, if we talk about this particular case, do you think it is premature for UN peacekeepers to withdraw from southern Lebanon? Why or why not?
Okay, for this question, I actually, in 2017, almost 10 years ago, I had been there, southern Lebanon. And it's almost 10 years has passed by, but I still think right now, putting back the peacekeepers right now is definitely not a good decision. I mean, too early and carries huge risks. The reason I think want to say, firstly, I think the ceasefire now has not got a deal, right? The ceasefire has broken down, and fighting is still escalating between Israel and also Lebanon right now. And Israel has turned southern Lebanon into a war zone. And right now, they have military troops deeper into the area in the southern Lebanon. So I think the clashes is intensifying. Civilians are still left directly in the crossfire if peacekeepers leave. This is first reason. And secondly, I think Lebanon's national army is not ready to take over. We can see that Netanyahu met the leader of Lebanon in Washington several days before, but I still think the national army, they are not ready. They lack proper equipment, funding, and manpower. So it can neither stand up to Israeli forces nor disarm Hezbollah. So I think this will lead to great chaos in the southern part of Lebanon. And thirdly, I think UN keepers still serves as a very important, a communication bridge in this region. So I do not think right now, a hasty withdrawal will create a very dangerous security vacuum in this part.
Okay. Kevin, despite Washington's move to roll back its funding and broader support for UN peacekeeping missions, we can talk for days on end about how Washington is not supportive enough nowadays. But despite this fact that we all agree upon, the United States actually continued to be the largest financial contributor in this regard last year, accounting for some 26% of the UN peacekeeping budget. So do you think the United States is actually still playing a kind of central, irreplaceable, indispensable role in UN peacekeeping missions?
I think it, in some senses and on face value, yes. The estimate of 26% assessed share of costs, means simply that it would be very difficult for other states to cover the funding shortfall, if this U.S. withdrawal becomes a permanent feature of U.S. relations. Of course, the U.S. is not going to withdraw from the Security Council, but they may become a spoiler by vetoing efforts by the international community to support peacekeeping. And that would be in some ways a very sharp turn, a U-turn in United States behavior in the Council, where it was in the past, after the Cold War period, it was quite critical of other countries vetoing efforts to get involved in peacekeeping support and so on. But look, when we go back to the questions about UNIFIL, about Lebanon that you asked, it's hard to not see this action in the Security Council in the end of the mandate to as a part of a larger scheme when we look at the subsequent invasion of southern Lebanon by Israel, right? So it's of course don't have evidence, but it seems that there is a kind of larger plan in place. And if this is a larger plan that the United States is pursuing in other contexts, then certainly its role is not indispensable. Its role is quite the opposite. It's going to lead to a lot of conflict, right? And this has to do with the Trump administration's very deep belief in the hard power capacity of the U.S., which is slightly ironic because of his criticism of forever wars. He should be quite aware of the limitations of hard power. But his behavior now, the administration's behavior now, seems to have an unqualified faith in hard power's capacity to dictate political outcomes. And as Dr. Wen Jing pointed out, this is going to lead to a very serious security problems in the region. So we could see a reversal of progress that's been being made since the 1980s in Lebanon. When we consider that the U.S. though is the largest funder, certainly if the U.S. were to address its arrears problem and return to the table in good faith, that's the best case scenario for the UN peacekeeping and for the Security Council.
So, by the way, Kevin, do you think it is fair to say, or can we put it this way, that in this particular case regarding UN peacekeeping missions in southern Lebanon, the U.S. policy, the U.S. action has been somewhat hijacked by Israel?
To an extent. I don't take the position that the U.S. that Israel's just pulling the strings, but certainly, when we look at the Iran conflict, when we look at Israel's occupation of southern Lebanon, which I believe will turn into a long-term occupation, I don't see Israel withdrawing. Certainly Israel is influential in this, but again, I don't subscribe to the position that just Trump is just doing whatever Israel tells him.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let's take a very short break here, and then coming back, our discussion will continue. Stay tuned. You are back with World Today. I'm Ding Heng in Beijing. Today we are talking about challenges including funding crunch and shrinking personnel faced by international peacekeeping missions. Joining our discussion, Dr. Wen Jing, Research Fellow at Center for International Security and Strategy, Tsinghua University. Professor Kevin Nauen, Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences and International Relations at Pannasastra University of Cambodia and a Senior Research Fellow at the Asian Vision Institute. Joseph Siracusa, Professor of Global Futures with Curtin University in Australia. So Professor Joseph Siracusa, going back to you, last year, China was the second largest financial contributor to UN peacekeeping, accounting for almost 24% of the UN peacekeeping budget. It is also worth noting that China's financial share in this regard increased by 5% compared to the previous budget cycle. Why do you think China's share has increased substantially?
Well, I mean, China believes in international peacekeeping and conflict management. I mean, it's a lot of nations in the United Nations do. I think China has been playing a very proper role, a good citizen for the last several years. And, there has to be some benefit at the end of the day in doing these kinds of things because, China, like a lot of other of the 193 nations there, believes that in the doctrine of non-intervention, except when people are dying or starving or you have to stop fighting or something like that. China also realizes that in the absence of the United Nations, they're going to have bilateral solutions to problems. You're going to have ad hoc solutions to problems. You're going to have, President Trump writing a plan for Israel or Gaza on the back of a napkin at Mar-a-Lago one afternoon. I mean, all kinds of crazy things happen. So China sees it's in its best interest to prop up this regime. And I think that's the right thing to do. And look, it's not impossible for the United States one day just to leave. I think of it historically, all the work I've done on the First World War and the United States' involvement in the First World War. The United States and Woodrow Wilson tried very hard to create a League of Nations in which the United States would play a major role in the international community. And within a very short period of time, the United States left the League of Nations, didn't even answer the phone, for goodness sakes, and left the world to stew in its own juice. I mean, that doesn't work very well. But in the United States, there's a long history of oscillating between getting involved and getting out of something. So, but the United States, at the end of the day, will find the United Nations very useful because there are aspects of it that help American policy. And of course, America's need to be involved in humanitarian assistance, economic assistance is endless. I mean, American people are very generous that way. They want to be involved in this kind of thing, and they want their government to be involved in it. You just can't turn your back on people who have no place to sleep and nothing to eat and who can't find a vaccine because U.S. aid and medicine has dried up. I mean, this kind of callousness just doesn't play very well, and it looks very bad for the legacy of various presidents or politicians involved in this. So we got a lot of things at play here. We got the United States ponying up money to the extent that it can vote, but not much more than that to help. The U.S. overall is $4 billion down, $2 billion alone in peacekeeping, and it doesn't like the way certain things take place, wants to control it. But then again, at the end of the day, the United States can get a great deal out of the United Nations and vice versa. That's where all the talk about the NPT treaty, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, is going to take place, and arms control and the rest of it. These are important forums going forward in the future. The United States is deeply involved in these things, and it would be very foolish for the United States to turn its back on this. And I think there's a lot of people who realize this too.
So, Dr. Wen Jing, for quite some time, China has contributed significantly more uniformed personnel, like soldiers, to UN peacekeeping missions than the other 4 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Now, if you take a look at the military parade held in Beijing last year to mark the 80th anniversary of the victory in the Chinese People's War of Resistance against the Japanese aggression. There was a very important formation during the parade representing China's blue helmet UN peacekeeping soldiers. So now, by boosting its financial contribution as well, what do you think is the key message sent by the Chinese government?
Okay, for my understanding, I think for everyone, who adhere to the international principle, and also we all know that the United Nations is the foundation of the international order, which established after World War II, right? Along with the World Bank, is also the fundamental, the international foundation for economic order, right? So you just mentioned China's growing troop and also financial contributions actually send a very core message that China has a very firm support for the multilateralism and also the international order which established after the World War II. I think China is supporting the UN-centered international system with its real action. Right? You just mentioned the military support and also the economic support. So right now, some major powers like US, they are cutting funds and also retreating from global responsibilities, right? But for China, I think right now we still stands with the UN, and we still think that it is the best framework for maintaining peace in the current stage. So this is the first aspect I want to say. Secondly, I want to say that I think we are just demonstrating major powers' responsibility. Yes, right now, are the largest, troop contributor among the P5, and second largest, maybe budget donor. China is working, trying to take the responsibility. We are responsible major power, and especially we are rising power, right? But we still seek status through contributions, not just confrontation or hegemony. We do not have a hegemony or seek for hegemony in the international order. That's the second reason. The third, I want to say, actually, China's peacekeeping is based on neutrality, and we still adhere to non-use of force. We stick to self-defense. So, although we are support UN in military aspect or financial aspect, we still signals a very different approach in that we just respect sovereignty and avoid taking sides. So we just support with no taking side. So I think this is a very positive signal that China is doing in a way, the very unique way to support the UN, to support the international order which established after the World War II.
Okay. So, Kevin, what is your take or what is your perspective regarding China's perceived strong support for the UN peacekeeping missions, or in a bigger picture sense, China's backing of the multilateral international governance system?
Yeah, well, I do think agree with a lot of what was just said. However, I think that China, the position has changed sharply over time, where for the Cold War period, certainly China was much more suspicious of the United Nations system and less involved. And that changes after the Cold War, but there's a big shift under President Xi Jinping's leadership in this direction. So I think that's partly responsible as well. And I see it as more recent and not as long-term. And it does, I think, bode well in the sense that it reflects China's understanding of what a responsible major power should behave, how they should behave in support of multilateralism. But when we look at the funding issue, it's a formula for funding, to assess funding based on, economic indicators in a state. So it's China's economic growth itself, which kind of explains the increase of funding over time. But that doesn't explain, some of the stronger commitments in terms of boots on the ground and so on that we see. So, my concern, though, is that, again, China has a different model, which is trying to mediate find some sweet spot middle ground between first-gen peacekeeping, which was problematic for many reasons, and that it was ineffective, and then the more robust model of peacekeeping that we might see under what Joseph mentioned related to R2P, right, which was discredited with the Libya intervention, which is extremely unfortunate because we shouldn't blame R2P for that. It was about how R2P was applied. But either way, I think it is quite discredited, of course, in that since that time, some of the P5 states have been, very worried about a repetition of that abuse of power. So China has a new model that it's trying to promote in peacekeeping, sometimes in the academic literature referred to as the sovereign model, which respects state sovereignty and consent. But I don't see it at this point as getting around a lot of the dilemmas that we already saw in the history of peacekeeping, right? Trying to mediate that middle ground between a robust model, which allows for abuse of interference, and the first generation model, which is, falls into a kind of impotency in relation to conflicts and peace making, right, rather than peacekeeping. So, I wish China well, and I do approve of China's position compared, relative to the U.S., because at least China's staying engaged and continuing to, support the multilateral system, support the funding, and being an advocate of peacekeeping. That's the first and most important step. So when I have my reservations about China's sovereign model of peacekeeping, it has to do with the practice. But overall, again, I think that attempts are better at withdrawal. So I approve.
Yeah, thank you very much. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the mounting operational challenges facing the UN mean that international crisis responses are increasingly taking the form of unilateral, bilateral, and ad hoc arrangements. Joseph, do you have concerns about such kind of arrangements? I mean, compared to multilateral UN-centered peacekeeping missions, what could be the downsides of such arrangements?
Well, I mean, it's just powers with more authority and more clout come in and impose their will on a neighbor or some place that interests them, some place that may have rare earths under the ground or something like that. I mean, it can go in the wrong direction. I mean, the multilateral solution is the right one. But look, before we get too gloomy about this, I mean, aside from the United States and a few others who don't want to pay their bills, I think there's kind of widespread support for UN operations in principle. And I think that the trick here is to get nations involved to provide predictable funding over a period of time, and then they create the political space to let the United Nations do its job. I mean, this is a two-way street. You just, the United Nations just doesn't do what it wants to do. It wants to do what the powers who run the United Nations want them to do. So, we have to give the United Nations, the peacekeepers, the space to do what they've been trained to do. And I think we have to raise awareness among publics and others that certain powers have an obligation to come up with the money. I mean, the money is the lifeblood here. I mean, without the money, you can't send people to certain places. But I think it's important for a number of nations that support the UN peacekeepers, and I think most of them do, as a matter of fact, just to provide this space after they provide more money to let the peacekeepers do their job as they've been trained to do. So I'm not completely gloomy about this. I mean, it's very hard for me to watch the United States retreat from its responsibilities. I mean, this looks very selfish and calculated and all the rest of it. And frankly, the last 4 or 5 people we've sent to represent the United States and the United Nations, they're not too smart. They seem very marginal indeed, as a matter of fact. They'd gone to the United Nations to give them a bad time instead of coming to the party. There was a time in my lifetime where we sent people to the United Nations who actually believed in the moment and what they were doing. Now we send people who don't really care or know much about the United Nations, and they wind up yelling at people and doing certain things in the Security Council and then barking at the General Assembly when they want to go in a different direction. But look, let's forget all that for a minute. I mean, I think there is a lot of goodwill in the United Nations to keep up the peacekeeping. And I've seen the peacekeepers at work. We've all seen them on television, and we've heard from peacekeepers in different places. I mean, aside from the few bad actors who got everybody else in trouble and made things look rotten, I think the peacekeepers do a terrific job, and they put their lives on the line. I mean, they're not getting paid a lot of money to keep the peace in these areas. I mean, I think saving human life at the end of the day is what the United Nations is all about. It's to preserve life for people who aren't going to have much of a life, and as long as nations like the United States start to move away from their international responsibilities, there are going to be certain things that take place that are going to create millions of people on the move looking for a place to rest their heads and to eat and to find water and the rest of it. I mean, the United States is not only turning its back on its international obligations here, it's exacerbating the migration mood in the world. I mean, people will be on the move, and they're going to go to North America, and they're going to go to Europe, and they're going to go to different places, and they're going to create all the problems that we've had the last 10 years. I mean, the way to prevent those problems is to help the United Nations solve those problems in situ. And so, this is an important lesson for the United States to learn that, and it's not too late, by the way.
Kevin, besides UN peacekeeping, we know the broader UN ecosystem is also facing some kind of funding crunch. In terms of the UN's regular budget, we know that's something separates from the budget for UN peacekeeping. So in that regard, the regular budget for 2026 is lower than that for the previous year. So when resources are shrinking across the broader UN system, from humanitarian relief, post-conflict reconstruction, early warning to mediation support, how do you think this could affect UN peacekeeping operations in return, especially in terms of building sustainable conflict prevention?
Well, I think it's going to compound the problems, a kind of multiplier effect. Peacekeeping is embedded and situated within the broader context of UN activities in relation to humanitarianism and development support. And so broader cuts to the overall budget will negatively impact the capacity to do peacekeeping, at the same time as exacerbate the problems that generate the need for peacekeeping. So I think that's a cause of major concern that we should be worried about. When you look at the peacekeeping assessments over time, and again, there's a kind of repetition. If you go back to Agenda for Peace, the supplement to the agenda, the Brahimi report, the high-level panel on threats, the Hippo report, there's an increasing recognition of the need for peace building and addressing root causes, right? Both in the sense of post-conflict, but also pre-conflict prevention, pre-conflict mediation, preventive diplomacy. I mean, all of that's going to suffer with the broader cuts in financial problems of the United Nations.
Dr. Wen Jing, since 2016, the UN Peacekeeping Ministerial has been held roughly every 2 years as a high-level political forum to discuss the future of peacekeeping. In this mechanism's 2025 meeting held in Berlin, Germany, representatives from about 130 UN member states participated, and 74 countries pledged to support to strengthening peacekeeping capabilities. By comparison, at the mechanism's 2023 meeting held in Ghana, 91 member states participated, and only 33 pledged the contributions. Do you think this is actually a positive sign that more countries are starting to see the significance, the importance of peacekeeping at a time when our global conflicts are becoming more fragmented and more complicated? Let's put it this way.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I do think it's a good signal. It's a growing recognition of UN peacekeeping importance. amid this very complex conflict world. There's so many conflict happened. So this is a very good signal. And also, I think this trends also stand out. There's more wider political, more and more country, including many from global South countries. They see peacekeeping as a very, effective tool to stabilize conflict, because they cannot solve that alone. So they need to join and to just let more countries to stand together, do this together. This is first trend. And the second trend, I think, is shift to practical, based on pledges. Like in Berlin just mentioned, more than 50 countries offered troops, and also some offered training, right? So I think they are not just provide cash. It shows that countries want peacekeeping to be more effective, not just the symbolic, right? So this is the second point. I think, lastly, maybe I think this is action against unilateralism. More and more global South countries, they realize that maybe they can have their own ability to stand in the global stage.
Okay. So, Professor Joseph Siracusa, what needs to be done in order to convert broader political supports that we have mentioned for peacekeeping into some kind of tangible actions and policies?
Well, I think a number of the nations who haven't been able to participate in peacekeeping can see this as a positive opportunity. Yes, some of the larger powers don't want to pay their bills, and they don't want this to succeed very much. But this is an enormous opportunity for small and medium-sized states to participate in the international life, in the international community, and perform important work, and equally important to get critical experience. As a matter of fact, I think a lot of this can be the slack can be picked up by small and middle states coming together and playing their role. And of course, this requires some kind of an awareness raising. Somebody has to, from a middle state, has to point out that there are important things to be done in the future. And if some of the great powers do not want to do this, and President Trump is involved in wars everywhere. President Putin is involved in his own war. These people are spending billions of dollars smashing each other up or smashing up different places, whereas the medium and small powers say, well, look, that's not exactly what I'm looking for here. I want to participate in the international community, the life of the international community. And what can be more important than saving lives, or a smaller middle power, to get involved in these things? I've spent time in Austria, and Australia enjoys being a middle power in the sense that it can work with the United Nations and do important things. So I think we're going to have to rally the small and medium-sized powers, who make up the bulk, by the way, of the United Nations, and get them to take up the slack here and play their role.
I take your point. So, Kevin, are you optimistic that UN member states will treat the current funding crunch faced by the peacekeeping missions as an opportunity for constructive reforms? Why or why not?
I'm somewhere in the middle on that one. If we look at the empirical evidence, historically, there's been, again, multiple rounds of crisis and many reviews that I mentioned previously, assessments of peacekeeping and recommendations. And, the most substantial recommendations throughout that process, I think Agenda for Peace was 1992. So, the most substantial recommendations were never adopted or put into real practice. So, if we hit the historical record is not particularly good, but, there's always the potential that the need and the demand is so great that it inspires and motivates, incentivizes action on the part of states. Joseph mentioned small and middle powers. That's also, I think, the way to go. There's a lot of argument to be said that middle powers are the ideal peacekeeper because they generally don't have too much national interest at stake in the conflict the way that major powers do, right? Where they historically tend to co-opt the conflict and try to direct it in a way that serves their national interests. So they see the conflict as just another extension of their own power competition. But I don't think, we're going to expect too much change through the Security Council. There's not going to be any admission of new members, likely. Even if it does, it's not going to, I think, affect anybody's veto power. I see states continuing to veto, right? If China emerges out of this transitional period as the more staunch supporter of peacekeeping operations, I see the U.S. Or other states vetoing those potential operations. So I think the Uniting for Peace General Assembly resolution is potentially the foundation and the way to go, and also working through regional organizations. I think there's some potential for, if we look at the African Union, for example, for regional organizations to assume the authority to more strongly get involved without waiting for a Security Council approval. So we might see some creative multilateral, but not at the level of the United Nations itself, outside the United Nations, coalitions of willing states and so on, to get involved in contexts when the Security Council is frozen.
Dr. Wen Jing, what reforms, in your opinion, are urgently needed for UN peacekeeping operations?
Okay, thank you. So for my understanding, I think UN peacekeeping operations reform is not a simple question. I mean, actually, it's a question which, hit here to the reform of the whole UN system. Peacekeeping reform is actually the core part of the overall UN reform. And as we all know, I just mentioned that UN is, yes, fundamental basis of the international order after the World War II. So it mainly carries 5 key areas: the Security Council, peace and security, development, human rights, and the international management. So for UN peacekeeping operation, the reform should be focused on to the political solutions stick to political solutions to conflicts. So this is the main concern. We have to have a very sharp and focused mandate. It must be realistic and prioritized, and also tailored to local needs, with very clear methods to solve this problem. And the second thing I think is very important, is stable and adequate funding right now. We just discussed the shortage of the UN system, right? Also, especially the peacekeeping operations. So I think the reform needs to be done on the fund. Member states have to pay on time and to pay in full. So this is a very important and essential part of this organization to keep going. So I still adhere to that. The UN is a necessary part for the international order right now. So we still adhere to this system.
Well, a big thank you to our panelists. Dr. Wen Jing from Center for International Security and Strategy, Tsinghua University, Professor Kevin Nauen from Pannasastra University of Cambodia, Professor Joseph Siracusa from Curtin University in Australia. That's all the time for this edition of the program. I'm Ding Heng in Beijing. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.